Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello everyone, my name is Arin and welcome to my presentation video. In today's presentation, I'll share my findings from specifically reading the new criticism section of the book titled The Critical Theory Today by Lois Tyson, and also from the book Introduction to Literary Studies by Mario Kaller. We'll look at how new criticism studies literature, how it examines text, and why it remains important till today. I'll go over the background of this theory and then the main ideas and its elements and how they analyze using this theory. So let's begin! So, the definition of new criticism. New criticism was once one of the most important ways of studying literature, especially from the 1940s to the 1960s. Although it's no longer used today as an official theory, it still has a strong influence on how people read and how they analyze texts. New criticism, it became the main approach to studying literature in the English-speaking world during the 1930s and 1940s. It was led by critics like William K. Wimsatt, Alan Tate, and G.C. Ramsden. And new criticism, it remained dominant method for over 30 years. The main idea of new criticism is that a work of literature should be understood by focusing only on the text itself, not the author's life, the reader's feelings, or the historical background. Studying new criticism is important because it helps us to understand not only how we analyze literature today, but also why later theories developed the way they did. Many modern approaches like the reader response criticism, the structuralism, the deconstruction, and new historicism were created as reactions against new criticism's focus on the text alone. So, while new criticism itself is no longer practiced, its ideas continue to shape the way we think about and how we interpret literature. Moving into the background of new criticism, before new criticism happened, most people studied literature through what's called biographical historical criticism, which meant that they tried to understand a text by learning about the author's life and the historical period that it was written in. For example, if someone studied a poem by Wordsworth, they might talk about his family, his beliefs, and the events of his life instead of actually analyzing the poem. In that approach, the text was often treated as just a reflection of history, or the author's personality, rather than a piece of art with its own meaning. Now, new critics, they disagreed with this method. They argued that the only thing that truly matters when analyzing a piece of art or literature is the text itself, the art itself, the words, the structure, and the language that appear on the page. The critics, they believed that readers should not only rely on outside information, like the author's biography or the time period, to understand a text's meaning. Instead, everything that we need to know and how to interpret a work is already contained within the work itself. They also pointed out that we can never be completely sure of an author's intention, what they meant or wanted their work to say. For example, we can't ask Shakespeare what he meant when he wrote Hamlet, and even if he had explained it, that explanation would only tell us what he wanted to express, not necessarily what the text actually does. Sometimes a work can have meanings that even the author didn't notice. Now, because of this, the new critics, they rejected the idea that an author's intention equals the text's meaning. They called that mistake the intentional fallacy. In their view, the job of a literary criticism is to analyze the text as an independent work of art, not as a reflection of the author or their time, and to find the meaning through careful reading of the text itself. Just as new critics rejected the idea that a text's meaning depends on the author's intention, they also rejected the idea that it depends on the reader's feelings or opinions. They argued that readers might respond emotionally to a story that is based on their own personal experiences, not on what the text actually says. For example, someone might dislike Hamlet's mother because she reminds them of their own mother, who might be a bad person as well, and then assume that the character is meant to be bad. This kind of response based on the emotion rather than the text is what new critics called the affective fallacy. The affective fallacy is the mistake of confusing the meaning of a text with the emotional effect it has on the readers. If everyone interprets a story however they personally feel, there will be no shared standards for understanding literature, only personal reactions. To new critics, that would turn the work into something that is meaningless. Instead, new critics said that the only reliable way to find meaning is through what is called close reading, or carefully studying the language and the structure of the text itself. They focused on a text's formal elements, like its imagery, its symbols, its metaphors, its rhyme, its rhythm, its setting, its plot, and its characters. These elements form the structure of the work, and by analyzing them, readers can uncover the text's internal meaning. The new critics also believed that a literary work is timeless and autonomous, meaning it stands alone, independent of its author, reader, or the historical context. In short, new critics saw literature as a self-contained work of art. To truly understand it, the readers they must focus entirely on what's inside the text, its language, its structure, and the form, not on the author's life or the reader's emotion. For new critics, literary language is very different from scientific or everyday language, because scientific language aims to describe facts clearly and accurately. It uses what is called denotation, meaning each word points directly into a specific object or an idea. It doesn't try to be emotional or artistic. Its goal is to explain the world as accurately as possible. Everyday language also focuses on practical communication, getting things done, so it usually isn't meant to sound beautiful or symbolic. Literary language, however, works differently. It depends on what is called connotation, the layers of meaning, the feeling, and associations that words carry beyond their dictionary definitions. For example, the word father simply means a male parent in its denotation meaning, but it also suggests ideas of authority, ideas of protection or care, the connotation meaning. Literature uses these deeper shades of meaning to create emotion, to create mood, and to evoke imagination. In other words, literary language doesn't just describe, it expresses it. Because of this, new critics, they argued that a literary work's form, like its structure, its word choice, its rhythm, its imagery, and etc., and its meaning cannot be separated. It's also important to see how critics define the complexity within a text. New critics, they believed that the complexity of a text comes from the conflicting messages in it. This complexity often appears through four literary devices, namely the paradox, irony, ambiguity, and the tension. The first literary device is the paradox. So a paradox is a statement that seems to contradict itself but reveals some kind of deeper truth. For example, it is in Johnny Mitchell's lyric, "You don't know what you've got till it's gone," which expresses you only realize the value of something after losing it. New critics, they viewed paradox as a mirror of real life. Since human experiences are full of contradictions, they believed that great literature also reflects that same complexity and that same depth. Next is the irony. Now, irony in new criticism can appear in two ways. First is in its simple form. Irony happens when the context makes a statement or event mean something different or opposite to what it seems to say. For example, in Edith Wharton's The House of Mirth, there's a wealthy man that says divorced women shouldn't be invited to dinner unless they've married someone richer. His hypocrisy creates irony because he claims to value morality, but actually he only values the money. But for new critics, irony also had a broader meaning. It wasn't just about sarcasm or contradictions, it was about the existence of the multiple perspectives within a text that makes it realistic. For example, in Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility, we can see several ways to interpret the character Willoughby. We might criticize him for betraying Marianne. We might forgive him because his choices come from love, from weakness, or desperation. We might even pity him for the suffering of his own actions. At the same time, we can also recognize that Marianne's unromantic stubbornness contributes to her heartbreak. Now, because each of these views feels valid, none can be completely trusted or rejected. That mixture of conflicting viewpoints creates irony. It shows how complex people and situations really are. If the story were one-sided, if Willoughby were purely evil and Marianne entirely innocent, it would feel flat and unrealistic. Readers might even see the story as overly simple or moralistic, and they see it as kind of boring. So new critics, they believe that if a text shows its own complexity, it becomes more believable and complete as a work of art. Now, the third literary device is ambiguity. In literature, this means that a word, image, or event can have more than one meaning. So instead of being a problem like in a normal language, ambiguity in literature is seen as a strength because it makes the text more deeper. It allows readers to find multiple layers of interpretations. In short, ambiguity for new critics is a sign of good literature because it shows complexity and unity of the meaning and not confusion at all. And the last literary device is tension. Tension in new criticism is about how a literary work connects or balances opposites. It adds complexity to a story or poem. And these opposites can be ideas versus images or conflicting emotions and themes. Tension can also come from the way a text holds together contradictions, like reality versus illusion, hope versus despair, or truth versus deception. In short, tension is what unites all the text's opposing ideas into a meaningful whole. It keeps the story balanced and gives it emotional and some symbolic depth. After discussing how literature can be full of paradox, irony, ambiguity, and tension, the new critics ask an important question. If a text contains so many contradictions, what keeps it together? Their answer was order and unity. They believed that great literature doesn't just contain conflict and complexity, it also organizes all those parts into one balanced and meaningful whole. This brings us to their method, finding order and unity in text. Here, order refers to the way all the elements of a text, like its language, its structure, imagery, and tone, are arranged to create balance. When this organization works perfectly and every part contributes to one main theme, the result is what new critics called organic unity, the complete harmony between a work's form and its meaning. A theme is more than just the topic. A theme is the core underlying idea or message that the writer wants to communicate to the reader. Two stories might share the same subject, like love or betrayal, but their themes can be very different depending on how their elements interact. Like love can be a very devastating thing, or maybe love can also be something very healing. To find organic unity, new critics used, again, close reading, a careful analysis of how a text's elements contribute to its overall meaning. Critics examine how language, structure, imagery, and figurative devices work together to form a complete work of art. These expressions often go beyond their literal meaning to convey emotion, suggest ideas, or add symbolism. There is imagery, which describes things through the senses, like the sight, sound, touch, taste, and smell, to create a feeling. For example, a writer might describe the cold wind biting against the skin, or the sweet scent of blooming jasmine, to help readers feel and imagine the scenes more vividly. When certain images appear repeatedly or carry deeper meaning, they become symbols, which hold both literal and figurative significance. For example, a rose might not just mean a flower, it can also symbolize love or even beauty, depending on how it's used in the text. Other figurative devices include metaphor and simile. A metaphor compares two unlike things by saying one is the other, transferring the qualities to show a deeper connection, like saying time is a thief, to suggest that time takes things away from us. Simile does the same thing, using like or as, making the comparison more clear but softer, such as saying, her smile was like the sunlight, to show warmth and brightness of the person. Now together, these themes form the core of neo-criticism. They show that a text's meaning comes from the balance and the unity within the text itself, not from outside sources like the author or the reader. Neo-criticism is called intrinsic and objective criticism because it focuses entirely on the text itself as the only source of meaning and value. Critics believe that interpretation should come only from what's inside the work, its words, its structure, imagery, tone, and symbols, not from outside factors like the author's life, the reader's emotions, or historical events. When analyzing a poem or a story, new critics examine each word and decide its meaning based on the text, not dictionary definitions or outside information. If a word has multiple meanings, they choose the one that best supports the text's theme. This shows that meaning in literature comes from the relationships between the word and the text, not from the outside world, not from external forces. New critics also avoided considering the author's identity, like their race, their gender or biography, or the speaker's psychological state, unless the text itself clearly includes these elements as part of its structure and theme. When such aspects are present, they are studied only for how they contribute to the work. Because their interpretation relies only on the text, new critics called their approach intrinsic criticism, intrinsic meaning inside. Other approaches that rely on psychology, sociology, or philosophy are called extrinsic criticism because they go outside the text to find meaning. They also call their approach objective criticism By focusing on the text's formal elements, critics can remain neutral and analytical, letting the work itself guide interpretation rather than personal opinion or emotion. It's main belief that the literary work is an independent whole, and the only way to analyze it is by looking into the text itself, it was soon challenged by newer ways of thinking. By the late 1960s, the critics grew more interested in how literature reflects and shapes social, political, and historical ideas, things new criticism intentionally ignored. So, since it focused only on the text itself and excluded the author, the reader, and the context, it couldn't address these more broader questions. And so, this gap, it led to the rise of new approaches, such as feminist, Marxist, and the new historist criticism, which it studies how literature connects to power, society, and culture. In short, new criticism's strength, its focus on form, it also became its weakness, because it left out the world beyond the pages. Now, neo-criticism's legacy. Even after its decline, neo-criticism left a lasting legacy that still shapes how we study literature until this day. Its highest contributions is the method of close reading, the careful and detailed analysis of a text's language, structure, and imagery, and the use of textual evidence to support the interpretation. Later approaches, including the feminist, post-colonial, and reader response criticism, they all borrow these techniques to explore the meaning within the text before applying the more social or political perspectives. In other words, neo-criticism may have faded as a theory itself, but its methods, like again the close reading, still remains the foundation of how we read and how we interpret literature today. Okay, the material of this presentation is over. Now I'm going to give the conclusion. To conclude, neo-criticism marked a major turning point in how literature was studied. Before it, critics often focused on the author's biography, historical background, or personal emotion, but new critics changed this approach by insisting that a text should be studied as an independent work of art, with meaning found only in the words and structure on the page. By emphasizing close reading, new criticism taught readers to pay attention to every detail, the imagery, the rhythm, the symbols, and the tone, and to see how these elements work together to create a whole meaning. There are also concepts like organic unity, paradox, irony, ambiguity, and tension showed that great literature, it balances complexity and order. They reveal deeper truths and human experiences. Although neo-criticism eventually declined in the late 1960s, its influence remained strong. Its focus on the text itself became the foundation for many modern theories. Those theories either built upon or reacted against it. Now we've reached the end of my video presentation. Thank you so much for your attention. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.